Michelle Berg of Elevated HR, and you're listening to HR Show and Tell. Today's guest is Lars Schmidt, bestselling author of Redefining HR. We talk what it takes to write a book, the relevance of said book in a time like Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, and of course, all things that can transform people teams to truly drive business results. It all starts right now.
So before we dive into the book, you kind of said you've been you're just outside of DC, you're a dad of two. Who are you? Like, tell us more about who you are, where you've come from, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, well, looking at my my camera, my webcam, apparently I'm like a disco man of mystery right now. So it looks like I've got some like weird filtering thing happening. I have no idea what's happening to my webcam. This is the first time this has happened, so I'm just gonna roll with it.
We've been in COVID now for a year, right? You'd think.
Yeah, I mean, I saw maybe some of your viewers were like, "Is this like a disco filter? Is this how this guy rolls?" And disco is awesome, but no. Usually I have a pretty legit camera, and apparently I don't right now. So I'm actually gonna let me see if I can do.
Oh, it could be your light. Yeah. Oh, yep. Oh. Now there was a bit of you got it.
Okay. Nothing like live video to be working through camera issues on the fly. So as you mentioned, I'm a dad. That's probably the most important start for me. I've got two girls, 4 and 6. I'm a husband. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a writer, podcaster. Basically, I try to get involved in as many projects as I can that are all about kind of accelerating growth and evolution in the field of HR. So I've been able to build this global network of progressive and modern HR and people operations, talent recruiting, however you want to look at it, all around the world, and really with more of a focus on those kind of at the leading edge of the field. And so that's ridiculously valuable for me. It's great for me to be able to plug into those organizations and get an inside look at what they're building and how they're doing it and what they're overcoming. But then through a range of media channels, for lack of a better word, I write for Fast Company, and the book obviously you mentioned, and host a podcast called Redefining HR. So I try to get involved in projects that shine a light on that great work that's being done, so that really with the aim of making it more accessible and easier for other practitioners to kind of see what great HR looks like today, and hopefully emulate some of those practices.
Awesome. So you've had, like you said, a pretty storied career, but you started in recruiting, from what I gathered from the book anyways. You've got a couple of good stories about that. And then along the way, you worked at places like Ticketmaster and NPR. And it even sounds like either you worked with the CPO from Hootsuite, or did you work directly with Ryan over at Hootsuite as well?
So I actually worked with Ambrosia.
Okay.
So Ambrosia Vertesi was their head of HR. She reported to Ryan. So I worked through her with Ryan on a few things here and there, but it's mostly with Ambrosia and with her team.
Yeah. When I first met Ryan, I think it was like back in 2011, I think. And he made me feel, this big, like HR sucks, basically, was his attitude. They were not where they are today they definitely went on an evolution. And I remember going, oh, yeah, you're right. Which is actually what's in your book quite a bit too, is like this embarrassment sometimes about even saying what you do and what you are and how you do that. But coming back to you, when you talk in the book about being in communications for like a month around Ticketmaster and the merger of Ticketmaster and Live Nation, were you a writer beforehand and then stumbled into communications, or was it the communications that really like, wow, I'm a writer now and I can do this and I love this?
Oh God, I still don't even know if I would call myself a writer. I mean, I do.
Well,
but
this shows you.
Yeah, well, there are books, but no, I mean, it was interesting. Like I never did any blogging or writing or anything like that before that move. But I would honestly, it was mostly emails. Like when I would craft emails to my team or to the HR team or the organization when I was running talent and recruiting, my boss kind of picked up on my writing and felt that she was like, you're talented in this space, you should do more of this. And so she created a role for me. There was a VP of HR where I still oversaw recruiting and talent, but I was creating an internal comms function and overseeing performance and employee engagement. It was like a couple different areas, but part of it was creating an internal comms function from the ground up. And so I had been doing that for about a month before they announced the merger. And, Live Nation didn't have anybody in internal comms. And, they didn't know that I'd only been doing it for a month and I had never had any background in it. And I was learning as I was going. They just go, oh, you've got an internal comms person. Cool. Like he's going to do the internal comms for the whole merger. So yeah, I was kind of thrown to the wolves in that sense. That's a pretty good motivator for figuring out how to do that, because I couldn't let myself fail. I couldn't let down my team by being ineffective in that role, because that a merger is a stressful thing, and you want, like, I empathize with that. I was experiencing that myself, so I wanted to be as open and transparent and as communicative as possible to our team that was kind of being impacted by everything. And so that's where I really started writing a bit more. And then, it wasn't really that I started, writing, I think, until I got to NPR and I started blogging. And then that was really, what I saw as kind of the beginning of my, my journey in writing.
Okay, cool. So just so you know, it's my dream to have published a book.
Yeah.
And the way that I say it like that is actually, I don't know if you've ever watched the TED Talk by Tim Urban, The Life of a Master Procrastinator.
No.
It's probably like it is my favorite book or TED Talk for sure, one of my favorite TED Talks, because I feel like it speaks to me. But he says in there too, it was always my dream to have finished a TED Talk, but not to actually do one and do the preparation for it. And that's where I've got these ideas, and I've got these thoughts, and I do blog. I certainly journal a lot, but they're never complete thoughts.
Yeah.
So take me through the process for you. Like, how many days did you end up writing? I mean, there are so many COVID specific examples inside the book. Was that an afterthought? Like, had you written most of it and went back and said, oh man, I could add this in and this in as well? Or what did that look like for you? Or did you just start June and go, I'm going to write a book?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. I think, the first book that I wrote was, I co-authored Employer Branding for Dummies in 2017 with Richard Mosley at Universum. And that was a really interesting exercise because, he had already signed on to do the book. And then, kind of towards, as he was approaching the deadline, had a lot of book to write. So brought me in to co-author it with him and cover basically half the topics. And I had a really condensed window to do kind of my part of the book, all the research, the writing, editing, everything like that. So that experience as my first time writing a book gave me a lot of discipline of like, okay, like deadline, you got to write, you got to figure it out. Cause I'm not like one of those natural writers. You mentioned people like Lori and Tim Sackett, and they're writing every day. Right. That's not me. I can't do that. So I have to really have something I want to say and convey in order to write that. And I don't have those thoughts on a daily basis. So when it came to writing the book, I signed the book deal with Kogan Page in January, set out to start writing and, wrote a little bit. I had an idea of what I knew what I wanted to say. I had an idea of the chapter framework, a loose idea. I had some of the, case studies and anecdotes I wanted to pull in from podcast conversations. So I had some of the material there. But then, COVID hits. And the beginning of COVID, I was maintaining an open source, coronavirus HR comms guide. So I dropped everything and did nothing but that for like 3 weeks, just because that was where I felt I could add value. And, I knew that we needed, wherever we could get guidance and ideas and support and windows into what our peers were doing, it would help us more effectively navigate that. And so I dropped everything to do that. And then, I started coming out of that and then started writing the book. And then, really, I think that I wouldn't necessarily call it procrastination because I was doing other things, but I was doing things other than writing the book. Like from March to probably March to the end of April, I didn't write a word, not one word. And then I realized, I'm behind deadline. I need to get on this. And I started cranking. And then, in those moments, I think the benefit of that was that, we were months into COVID at that time. So I was able to really make the story, make the book rich with stories of how COVID was impacting us. I was writing during, during and after George Floyd's murder and the increased conversation around racial equity and social justice and Black Lives Matter. And so I was able to account for that in the book. I think it ended up working to my advantage because I was able to make it a book that was actually topical and timely for the times we're living in right now, which, probably made it, I think, one of the first books focused on HR to kind of come out that was written in this new reality that we're living in. So, it worked because of that. It worked out in my advantage. But yeah, I think in total, I probably wrote the book in about 3 to 4 months with a pretty big gap in between.
Wow. That's incredible. And so then how did you run, like Amplify is an executive recruiting firm. Did you run that? Like, were you still heavily involved with that too? Or did you take a pause? Like, how did that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, I was still running it. Yes, I also took a part of the pause, and part of that was by design. Part of that was thanks to COVID. I think I do executive search and consulting, and I think at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was locked down, especially in kind of March through April, May, because they didn't know what was going to happen. They were trying to kind of clamp down on hiring, and some of the projects, that typically companies would bring me in for. So that timing worked out because it gave me the space to really focus on writing and researching and interviewing.
Sure.
But yeah, I was doing both of those in parallel.
Cool. And are you just a one-man show over at Amplify? Do you have a team over there?
No, just me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Some days, I mean, my team is on right now, so I probably shouldn't say it, but some days I dream of doing that again.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Your team was lovely, I'm sure. No, it's, every entrepreneur has to make their own call, right?
Right.
For me, I had opportunities to scale, especially early. I mean, I launched it right in the early days of kind of this current iteration of employer brand. And I was, one of the people doing, some really high profile work in that space, and had a pretty big, footprint that I could have leveraged to build a business and a company. But I was also a new dad at that time. And for me, I kind of looked at trade-offs. Like I was like, I can build a company and I could, be dedicated to that. And that's probably going to minimize the time that I'll have for family and kind of being here. And I already had a role where I was speaking at conferences and doing things like that. So I was already traveling for the things that weren't even directly work related. And so, for me, I made that call then that I didn't plan to hire. I didn't want to grow and scale. I wanted it to be more of a, for lack of a better, framing, a lifestyle business that would allow me to prioritize the things that I really wanted to prioritize at that point in my life. So that was the kind of driver in my decision making.
Yeah. I would say along that same vein, why I'm the opposite was I was a senior VP of HR, and I was always giving advice. Of course, like at that time, I was way too young to be a senior VP. I didn't have the words or the articulation at that time either. But what I thought though was, I'm going to show them that I can build a culture and I can do the things, and you can treat people with respect.
Yeah.
And you can have an engaged workforce by actually practicing what I preach. So that's been my driver. Like it actually makes me some days a terrible entrepreneur because I want to focus more on what their experience is and give them the things than sometimes go out and do what I think we say we do, which is support other organizations as their HR support. But yeah, I think it's important for anyone. I mean, this whole reason why I'm doing this is actually very similar to your open source. The idea behind this is that collaboration over competition. So normally we are highlighting local consultants within our province, but again, just seeing you and what it is that you've done, and just again the relevancy of your book, I truly am honored that you've chosen to be here and to share your experience with us. And in fact, I would even go on to say thank you for writing this book, because Lori Rudiman a couple of years ago had given me the advice that she was given: write the book that you want to see on the bookshelves.
Yeah.
And what's missing. And I would say that this is the only HR book, like specific to HR, that, ultimately goes, yes, finally, like I feel heard, I feel understood, I feel like all this stuff that we've been talking about, there's now data and someone else saying it. And it's like almost one of those things that, we've been talking about it and giving out to our clients as well, because this is it's such a great guidebook. I was going to say Bible, but that's totally inappropriate. So go with it was just such a guidebook for what you should be doing and relevant to today. So sincerely, thank you. The only other author that's ever done that is Glennon Doyle, when she wrote Untamed and told me it was okay to be selfish. I'd been
Yeah.
that forever, but you know, when I read it, it was awesome. So that's, I just thank you, because of it is just so refreshing. And mostly because I think too, your vulnerability in the book is pretty awesome. I mean, you've talked about not just, there are a lot of wins, and it is mostly what to do.
Yeah.
Right. But then you also haven't shied away from your learnings as well, like where you've maybe made a misstep or two. And what I really like to me out of the book, and hopefully I'm not giving away too much of it, I did give away 10 copies though, so just
Thank you.
But is that idea to be curious.
Yeah.
I feel like that to me was the lesson throughout. Like, you don't have to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Even when we talk about diversity, just ask the questions.
Yeah.
And I think that we almost, again, that it's a lesson in vulnerability in itself, because if we have to ask, then does that mean that we don't know? And then are we dumb because we don't know? And yet, and yet that's okay. That's the cool part of life and learning and this profession. And I think, you know, in HR, we are often tasked with, we need to know everything. We have to have all the right answers. And I know personally, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, no one does, right? Like, I think that you know, thank you for the kind feedback on the book. That was nice of you to share. Like, I think the advice Laura gave to you is similar to, you know, how I viewed the book. As I wrote the book, I wish I would have read. Similar to when we launched HR Open Source. Like, we built the thing that we wished we had when we were coming up in our careers. We being Ambrosia and I. I think when you know, the reality is, to some extent or another, we're all figuring this out. Like, none of us have all the answers. None of us are, and especially when you look at the field of HR, particularly through the lens of modern HR, it's so deep and it's so broad. You can't possibly know everything about everything. And you know, for me, even in writing this book, like, there's certain chapters or certain topics where I personally go deep based on my own, you know, 20 plus years of experience. There's others that I don't. And so I'm not going to fake being an expert and like throw a bunch of jargon in there when, like, that's not my wheelhouse. But, you know, the way I tried to write the book is I was like, you know, people analytics. I'm not a people analytics expert, but I know the people who are. And so let me bring them into the book. Let me have them kind of share, like, this is how you should be thinking about it. This is how we've evolved. These are the tools that we can use. These are the outcomes that we can impact. But that expertise is not my expertise. I think there has to be a level of humility when you're writing a book like this, to, you know, cite yourself when that's appropriate, but also pass the mic when it's not. And I think that, you know, for me, the probably thing I'm most proud about the book is it doesn't really, you know, I wrote it, but it doesn't center on me. It centers on, you know, over 50 practitioners who contributed case studies and personal anecdotes and essays and narratives about their work, because those are the people in the trenches right now doing this work. Like, I've been out of a practitioner seat for 7 years. So yes, I sat in it before. Yes, I deeply understand, like, the nuances of it, but I'm not in it, and I own that. So let me kind of bring in the people who do have that kind of now perspective, and, you know, harness their experience and their voices. And I'm, you know, beyond, you know, grateful that so many people were willing to come on and share in the book, because I think that's what made the book so special. It wasn't, you know, me writing it. It was all the different voices and contributions to it.
Yeah. No, I incredibly impressive, from Asana to HubSpot to, you've got all these great stories of people and like people eager to share in their success, or even in some cases, some of their not so great decisions that they've made. I mean, for me, I love a good failure story. That's typically where I go, because there is so much learning in that. And 2020 in particular, as an HR practitioner, because that is the world I'm living right now on a day-to-day basis, I have made so many mistakes.
Yeah.
And to know that I'm maybe not alone in that as well, in where I've been trying to pivot and need to pivot away from a thought process we've had, doesn't mean that it should be the same. And that's, again, what a lot of your book is also talking about, is just because you've done it this way doesn't mean you have to keep doing it either.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in failure too, like, failure can be a bigger teacher than success. Like, I think And especially when we look across the industry and we try to find examples, like we're beaten to death with like, this is supposedly a best practice and everybody should be doing X, everybody should be doing Y. Best practices, I mentioned in the book, like I think they're BS. I know I use proven practices, but it doesn't mean it's going to work in your organization. But I think when it comes to failure, back when we could travel and go to conferences and we, see cool companies talking on stage about all the cool things that they did, you usually, those conversations are centered around positive outcomes. They don't talk to you about all the things that they blew up to get to that success stage. And I want to know that. Like, I want to know, like, what, if I'm trying to build something that another practitioner can emulate or replicate, I want to let them know where the mines are. Like, what are the things that could blow up if you don't get that part right? And so I love failure stories. And I think, in the book, and it was one of the reasons when we did case studies for HR open source, you could not contribute a case study if you didn't include where you failed. And we probably scrutinized that section of the case study the most, because some people would be like, oh, we tried so hard, or like something like fluffy, like, what is your weakness kind of answer, and we'd push back like, no, it's got to be tangible, and or we can't run it, because that's what our readers expect. And I think that the more we can do that, the more it humanizes the experience, it makes it relatable, and it doesn't put success on this unattainable pedestal. You realize that there's the path to that pedestal is riddled with mistakes. So.
Yeah. Well, your Airbnb story that you share, right? Like how good they were. It starts off with like, look at what they did, and they treated them with empathy and respect, and yet they still got raked over the coals in the end.
Yeah.
And so what I really liked about that too was it's like, it doesn't matter, like they had the best of intentions, and in fact, they did better than most organizations.
Yeah.
At Elevated, we let go close to 4,000 people over Zoom during the pandemic. We support a lot in the hospitality industry, so hotels were all closed.
Yeah.
And it was an outcome of that. But we did not do what Airbnb did, or the majority of our clients did not do that, not anywhere close to that. And yet, here's the thing, like people are still going to choose to go out and say you're a terrible organization, etc. Would you have done anything different in that case? Would you have, what was their misstep? Or is it, as you say, you're still not always going to get it 100% right all the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were just some employees that felt the way they handled it wasn't right. And I mean, you have to, as much as I kind of shine a spotlight on like, this is living your values, like the way that they handled it, the way they communicated, the way that Brian specifically communicated the team is a great illustration of like really showing up as your values. But even in doing that, which I think they did the right things, and again, I'm an outsider looking in, so I don't have all the inside scoop, but from what I saw as that outsider, I thought it was, deeply compassionate, deeply empathetic for that experience. But I've also been, an employee who's been let go, and being let go anytime is difficult. Being let go in the early days of a global pandemic is devastating. So it doesn't really matter how well outsiders may, it matters what that individual impacted employee feels. And, they have every right to express their grievance and frustration. I don't think that there's any way to go through an event like that in a way that will be without any employee having any issue with anything that you've done. I just don't think that's possible. So yeah, I think if they had it to do over again, they might tweak some things here and there, but I don't think anything of substance from what I've seen.
Right. In other words, like don't necessarily beat themselves up too bad, because they did again a great job. You actually talk about burnout in I think it's the first chapter or second chapter as well, when it relates to and what I found really interesting out of that, you said that the CPO title, or the head of people, head of chief people officer, whatever it is, tends to be one of the things that a lot of, or it might have been in one of the case studies actually, but they were saying that is one of the titles that has the most or least retention in a way. Like there are always organizations looking for that head of HR. And I really saw that there's a tie-in to that level, the head of people burning out. And I know it's kind of in the book, but tell me, what do you think? Why is that? Why does the head of people tend to be on a higher burnout rate than other roles?
Yeah, I mean, look at the nature of the job, right? I mean, to me, the CHRO is the hardest. I mean, next to the CEO, it's the hardest job in the C-suite, because especially in modern organizations and modern operations, because the level of business acumen that you have to have, the understanding you have of finance and revenue and strategy and growth and market positioning and all of those things. You have to deeply understand those, not just at a surface level. And then you have to understand the organizational strategy, and you have to distill that into a people strategy. And then you have to, guide and kind of be the leading people person, quote unquote, for your entire organization. And so that's, overseeing your most volatile asset that a company has. That's a really, really hard job to do under normal circumstances. Now you're doing that in a pandemic where, where uncertainty is everywhere, anxiety is everywhere, stress levels are everywhere, where, we're quote unquote working remotely, but this isn't remote work. This is like as suboptimal as it gets. We've got kids at home. We can't leave our houses. I mean, this is not really remote work. And so you're having to navigate all of that. And as you're doing that, you're having, layoffs, you're having some employees, get COVID and pass, die, and or have loved ones who've died, being deeply, deeply impacted by a global pandemic. Like the level of emotional durability that's required in a CHRO job is it's off the charts when compared to the C-suite. And so often, they're looking after everybody else's needs, their team, the executive peers, the employees, they tend to rank last in that. And so I think that, we haven't gotten good at safeguarding ourselves. And when I say ourselves, like as HR leaders, I think our role is often in service of others. And so that, that inability to kind of put, some walls or guard ourselves a little bit. I don't mean emotional walls, but just like when you're hitting that edge, be like, I need a day, like I need a couple of days, like I've got to step back from this. I need a moment. And we also, because of the nature of our roles, we can't really talk to our coworkers about some of the stuff that we're dealing with, because a lot of it is sensitive or confidential. So if we don't have a great, robust peer system, a network that we can, of other typically CHROs and CPOs that we can commiserate with or vent with or get an extra, ear from, that's a lot for us to carry. So I think all of those things would have led to, record burnout in the role right now.
Yeah. And I think too, again, I know it's in the book somewhere too, but where employee experience is a line item, like a responsibility, and it's something that you're in charge of, but actually, from a direct impact, it's one of those that we have almost the least control over. We can't control still how a leader talks to another team member. We can have all the great assets and all the great artifacts that we can build and produce for you, but how it's actually implemented, how it's actually followed through on, we don't have as much control. It's not like a product management job where we've got a roadmap in front of us and everything that's in that roadmap is mine. Rather, I can tell you and I can theorize and I can give you the tools and the learning, but you still got to use it and do it.
Yeah.
And for me, being a massive control freak, that's probably where I've always struggled in HR, is that just do what it's said to do and you'd be fine. And that just doesn't work that way. Also, I need to work on my empathy, but anyways, that's different.
Yeah, I definitely get that.
So chapter 3, where you're talking about building a company for everyone. And again, so bold and so relevant and so necessary for right now, because it's one of those things where, and I've brought this up in previous webcasts that we've talked about as well, but we are the tone police often in HR. That's supposed to be our role, or that's the way that, at least that's what I was taught to do. And now and I have used the phraseology, it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. And so let's change that up a little bit. But come June and everything that happened around George Floyd's death, and the realization that probably isn't how you build an inclusive organization. You talk about why language matters. And we have a consultant that completely agrees with your sentiments around, specifically, you do such a good job of explaining why the term BIPOC in itself perpetuates systemic racism. Do you mind just diving into that a little bit more here, explaining for those who may not have heard that yet, why BIPOC actually isn't a term that, or is a term that we need to be more mindful of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue with BIPOC is that it strips away individual identity, right? You're grouping all of these different, very different, ethnic groups or racial groups together as a general, like, okay, you're white or you're BIPOC, as if like that is, you're centering whiteness basically when you're using that term. So that's one thing, and I think that when you're grouping different organizations, different groups, I should say, together, you're stripping away their individual identity. And it's like I had a conversation actually last week. I had Dr. Aaron Thomas, Upwork's head of talent acquisition and head of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, on my podcast, and we were talking about definitions of the term, and she had a really great Twitter thread a few weeks earlier about she was talking to somebody, and they used the term a diversity hire. She's like, let's unpack that. Like, what exactly is diversity hire? Like, what is the assumption that you're making, consciously or not, if you're using a term diversity hire to reflect hiring somebody? Like, so much of when you talk about unconscious bias, right, and systemic issues, especially as it relates to HR, oftentimes are because things are designed that center on whiteness, and so that makes any non-white person, other in some ways. It diminishes their value and their humanity, whether we intend to do it or not. And I'd like to, hopefully give most people the benefit of the doubt. It's not intentional, but because we're not mindful of our language and the words we use, it may come out with great intentions, but it's not being received in the way that you're delivering it, especially if you're, spending time with Black or brown or women employees when you're, a white man. And I think for me, it was probably, well, not probably, it was the most difficult chapter to write, primarily because of a couple of things. One, like, I'm a middle-aged straight white man, right? So I'm the classification that the world was built to cater to, right? And so for me to be writing about, the LGBTQ plus experience and the experience of, Black and brown employees and experience of women, like, obviously that's not my lived experience. And so it was really important for me to bring in a range of diverse voices on that chapter, because I knew I had blind spots, and I knew that I was still in a period of, learning myself, as I still am, particularly as after George Floyd's murder and the conversation around, anti-racism, and that is a journey, and that's a practice that happens every day with intention. It's not something that, you can be racist or not racist. There isn't not racist. You're either propping it up actively or passively, or you're actively working against it, I should say. And so all of that kind of went into writing the chapter. And then when I got done with it, it was really important for me to run that chapter by, some of my friends that don't look like me, to kind of get like, what am I missing? How am I hitting these points? And I think through their support, was able to write a chapter that I think was the right message that we needed to hear in HR, with the right, a degree of it kind of, hey, look, we have to own our role in all of this for us to grow and really move forward. And especially after the increased conversation on racial equity of 2020, like, we've got to own our past. We have to understand that, and then we can only move forward from that once we've owned what that past has been and our role in that. And so, yeah, I think that was, it was important for me to kind of put that down for HR as a function and as a discipline, particularly a discipline that's 70% white, to be able to say, like, if we really want to make a difference, this is how we really need to be thinking about things. And it starts with ourselves as an individual, before we can influence our organizations.
Yeah. One of my biggest aha moments this year was, we do a lot of handbook writing, and and really like to be creative around the handbooks, and what that looks like, and not have it wrought with legalese. That's kind of our MO. But when I recognized that I also needed to take an anti-oppressive lens to that as well, from an inclusivity perspective, reading it out loud to someone who doesn't look like me was the most, when I could hear it. So from a blind spot perspective, when I would say it out loud, and recognize the cringe-worthiness of the words, of the expectations, of the, really the underpinnings and keeping someone down. What a massive way to really approach and look at things from a different lens. And I think it was really important. So again, I recognize the different voices that you got, and that the effort and the work that you put into that, because same thing, we did Disrupt HR, and the one that sticks in my mind quite clearly is that HR is a 45-year-old white woman. We have a diversity problem.
Yeah.
And what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to do it differently? I think that's something that we have to keep top of mind. You talk about funding employee resource groups in the book as like one of your check marks from diversity. What size? Like, I have to admit, I don't see as many. So we serve, 20 to 100 employees, or maybe 200 employees would be our size that we work with. At what size do you usually see funded employee resource groups?
I mean, one, I would say that they're definitely not all funded. I think there's probably more that are not than are, which is a big issue in my mind. I don't know that there's necessarily a size. I think it depends on the company. Like, there's not like a general rule of, once you hit X amount of employees, then you should put ERG groups in practice. I think part of our role in HR right now is having ongoing and regular kind of input and dialogue from our employees. Like, especially in the employee experience chapter, I talk about the idea of co-creation. Right. So, it's not necessarily for us as HR leaders to say, okay, we've hit X milestone, now is the time for us to roll out ERGs. It's like, let's talk to our employees. Is this something that they want? Is this something they feel will add value to them? And so I think it's more of a decision with them rather than to them. But if you're going to do it, pay them, like pay, especially the leads. Like, you might not be able to pay everybody, but whoever is leading that group, they should have a budget. You should look at that as professional development for them. And I think in the book I spotlight Asana's practices there, which I think are some of the best I've seen. So I build things like that, and Anna Binder's on point with that.
Okay, so one of the things that I kind of promised to do, because I tend to talk and ask so many questions in these things, and it's not just about me, I do want to open up the questions to the rest of the group. We do have the chat, so there's either the chat that we can see it in, and we should also have the Q&A. If nobody's got a question that's ready just yet, you can start asking your questions is what I'll throw out, because I have tons more. Plus, there were a few people too that were not able to attend live, but wanted me to add in my questions as well. But we've got one here that says, what was the most innovative example in the book of redefining HR? So we'll start off with that one.
God, that's a really hard one to answer, primarily because there's intentionally so many examples in the book. One of my favorites, I don't know if there's necessarily the most innovative examples, but it was one that stood out to me, was at Siemens. Siemens is a large, multinational organization, hundreds of thousands of employees. Typically, that's not a place where you think of innovation happening. But they actually created a couple of years ago a dedicated future of work team within the organization that was, kind of a SWAT team, if you will, that really worked across thousands of HR employees to identify pockets of innovation and scale them, and incubate and test different theories and ideas. So especially for me, where a lot of my work, a lot of my network is more in the venture-backed startup space. That's more of my comfort zone than enterprise companies. But learning more about what they did and how they approach innovation at scale was something that I enjoy learning about. It surprised me.
Cool. Okay. So we've got another question here. Why did you choose to exclude the public sector, post-secondary, and unionized work environments? Was it just to keep the book focused, or is that not your area of expertise? And would you write another book on that topic?
I would say A and B. So part of it is, I just ran out of space. Like there's so many sectors to cover. I couldn't possibly get to everything in the book. And I also wanted to be very, as you mentioned from that question, own that, like right up front in the opening chapter, to say, hey, this book I don't hit everything in this. This is typically where, I tend to spend more of my time with the examples. Part of it is also because, I wanted to make the book full of tangible examples and case studies and practitioner spotlights. And those came from my network, and my network, certainly leaned more tech than those spaces. In terms of writing a book on that topic, I don't know. I would never rule anything out. I'm sure I would have a lot to learn in those sectors, but I would want to learn it before deciding whether I would write a book on it or not, because it's definitely a book that should be written. Whether I'm the right person to write it or not,
Sure.
I don't know. And I have no ego around, like, I have to be the source of, like, whoever, if somebody goes deep in that domain and you've got, insights into innovative practices, by all means, like, write that book and spotlight the work being done in those sectors. Because, I certainly don't want to frame that modern practices and innovation is only happening in the verticals and the sectors that I spend more time exploring in the book.
Yeah, Kathleen, I would say write the book you want to read.
Yeah. Hey, that's the advice that keeps on giving.
Just recycling advice.
Yeah, hey, that's okay. That's okay. There are no original ideas anymore. We just keep, we're retreading things. That's fine.
Another question here is, you mentioned the chapter most difficult to write, but what was the chapter you enjoyed the most?
I love this. Actually, I'm getting some questions I haven't gotten before in some of the PR I've been doing. So this is fun. I'm a recruiter by nature. I came up through recruiting, like writing that chapter. It was fun because I could use lots of personal anecdotes from my own past and my own experience, which I think was helpful. I was also able to, I know, leading minds in sourcing or becoming a talent advisor or employer branding, and we're able to kind of harness their experience and perspectives in that chapter as well. So, that was also a hard chapter because many books are written only on recruiting, and I could have written a book just on recruiting. It was almost harder to figure out what not to say than what to say, because there's so much that recruiting has become such a dynamic field. But I enjoyed that one just because that's kind of my wheelhouse.
Cool. All right. Another question popped up here. Does this book cover examples of employee engagement, development, culture for a small startup?
Yes. I'll give you a short one. Yes, it does. I mean, there are definitely some, from small startups, 50, 100, 150. There's companies that are giving examples at that size. So again, small is a subjective term, but I'm guessing you mean probably in that Series A, B round. And yeah, there are a handful of companies with examples in that sector.
Yeah.
In that size, I should say.
Our city is really struggling right now. I'll say that, period. We were oil and gas, centered around oil and gas, and we are transitioning. It's been really, really cool to watch the transition into the tech space. We've got, some great recognition software that's coming out in the employee engagement space. I'll even just do a quick shout out for kudos to, there's fintech is really blowing up, but that is one of the things right now it feels like, and you say it in there, culture is not a ping pong table. And I really like that part, because I feel like sometimes they're trying to emulate what the Silicon Valley once was, and they should have just learned so much more from that already, and we can be so much better now in this space, knowing what we've learned from Silicon Valley. But to echo that, if you read the book, definitely you will see so many nuggets, because you even in their own words, they talk about being 40 and 50 and getting to 600 overnight, basically. But that in itself is a lesson of what to do and what not to do. So yeah, definitely, I think you've got some amazing examples in there around that. All right, Sarah asks, what was the biggest lesson that you learned through writing this book?
I think that the biggest lesson that I learned was, let me think, because it's a thoughtful question. I want to give a thoughtful answer. I'm not, as I mentioned before, like, I'm not a prolific writer myself. And so I need to have deadlines, I need to have structure, but I also need to have, like, for me in writing, having an idea of what I want to say, but not being so rigid in that idea in its inception that I feel like I have to write that exact idea. Because what I found is in a handful of chapters, I thought when I was kind of putting the book together and doing the table of contents that the chapter would flow in one way. And as I got to writing it, it turned out differently. And I allowed myself to adapt with that. I was like, what am I feeling right now about this? And, it was also interesting, like writing the book last year, like during all the, my own kind of emotions and personal journey around like the pandemic and loss. And, for us in the US, like the political climate last year and Black Lives Matter. I mean, there's so many external things that, at any moment of time, it felt like the world was falling apart, and so having to also kind of navigate that and allow that into my writing a little bit so that it was, maybe more vulnerable in some areas than it would have been otherwise. It was more personal in some areas than it would have been otherwise. I think that was an important lesson for me, is to like not be rigid in like your vision for what you think you're going to write in a particular chapter, than kind of what comes to you once you actually start writing it.
Well, it's almost this MVP approach, it sounds like, right? The minimal viable product, like get it out, and then it can turn into something even more and pivot and reiterate. It sounds, yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Again, wish I had the discipline. That is my
Come on, you're a Schmidt. I thought I saw, our German sense of organization, and I always joked to myself about, just basically my dad. My dad grew up in Germany, and so he was always like very, very kind of organized, and I think that is one of the good traits that I picked up from him.
So I would say that is exactly my mom and dad, is the organized and very in a box, like you should see their house. However, I think I have fought my whole life against that, like that institution. And so now I'm wishing more of that was back in my life as I've gotten older. But yeah, no, I've done everything. I mean, if you saw my house, it's a disaster. So
I mean, let's be fair. All of our houses are a disaster right now. That's completely acceptable. Like you've got to forgive that one.
So a couple of questions here that came in through email. In 2018, and I think actually I recall seeing it in the book as well, you made reference to something like the best HR is invisible. To some HR professionals, I think that could come across as almost like a gut, like a hit to the gut. Because I think there are some HR people, well, I think everyone goes into HR thinking, I like people, I'm good with people. But so tell us a little bit more on your thoughts around that, and like help others well, the question is, tell us more of your thoughts on that as it relates to transformation.
Yeah. So I think that this is probably a good example of the article itself, providing more context and depth than the headline. So if you read the headline alone and don't dig into the article, it'll probably be easy to be like, okay, are you bagging on HR with that? And actually the opposite was true in the article. I think one of the biggest shifts from legacy HR to modern HR is that legacy HR built, and I cover this in the book a bit, but they built an apparatus around, they basically centered on command and control. And they viewed a command and control structure as a pathway to power. So, HR was the gateway through which, promotions happened, raises happened, purchasing decisions got made, like so many things that HR didn't really need to be involved in to the nuance of individual decisions. Yet we put ourselves in that position with the idea that it would give us more power, it would give us that seat at the table. If you look at modern HR teams, they're not insecure about the value they bring to the business. They're not about, if they can push something out to the managers and the departments and let them do that themselves, like provide frameworks, provide, guidance and structure, but push the decision-making out to the business, allow your leaders to lead, allow your managers to manage, not, engineer everything to flow through you. I think it's a fundamental shift from command and control to decentralize and empower. And that's really what the book, what that particular past article company illuminated, was that shift, and then giving some examples of, HR teams that are doing that and what it looks like. Because I do think that is really important. I think that, HR can't, if we hold on to process for the sake of process, right? That's what got us some of this, these stigmas and stereotypes, unflattering stereotypes that we've had to carry, we've been saddled with. That's not how many of us operate now, but that's how some of our legacy counterparts did, and some still do. And so that we're painted with that brush, even though that's not the way that we operate. And so that was really the intent of that article.
Okay, cool. You have a stat in the book that says candidate experience improves by 148% when candidates are asked for interview feedback. So the question is, tell us more about that. What kind of study did you do, and what does that feel like, look like? Why do you think feedback is important? Like that staggering amount, why is that so important?
Yeah, so the data itself, and I'd have to look at it. I would have referenced that with the citation in the book. It probably came from, I would guess, either LinkedIn, Greenhouse, or the Candies.
Okay.
I'm guessing it'd be one of those three sources.
Okay.
I think in terms of where it comes from, if we're asking candidates about our process, look, recruiting in reality is a rejection game. You reject the majority of your applicants. And so, you're in the business of saying no, and for lack of a better word, probably a little bit of hyperbole, crushing dreams, right? Like that's kind of part of what our role is in recruiting. And the way that we're doing that, the way that we're treating these people, these humans in this very vulnerable place, speaks volumes about how they will perceive us as an organization. So by asking them, how did this go for you? Where can we improve? What do you wish you knew? I mean, there's some basic questions, and the Candies specifically has some really great resources around, how to kind of design that survey. But it shows that you care. It shows that you're taking the time to actually, request that feedback. Now, whether you act on it or not, that obviously they can't control any of that. But just giving them a platform to share that feedback will raise the engagement scores, because they're accustomed to hearing nothing. They're accustomed to the black hole. They're accustomed in many cases not even hearing that they were not considered for a job, just applying and hearing nothing. So wherever they're so hungry for feedback, they're so hungry for any tangible expectation setting that you can provide.
So I agree with you. Like I do in principle, I agree, especially that, like I can see how that improves. But I think I've been burnt so many times by giving the real feedback as to why someone hasn't gotten the job that as a recruiter, I've even shied away from it. I want to, but I remember like just people spitting venom back at me when I gave the real feedback as to why they didn't get the role or what they were missing. And it comes back like very victim-y or very blame, well, it must be you, you're an idiot, you didn't see these things about me, thus proving why I didn't hire you. But I know that's why I shy away from it. And I don't want to. I believe in radical candor. I believe in helping and wanting to help. So is it not two ways? Is it not a two-way street there?
Well, so there's a couple things, they're soliciting feedback from a candidate about what they thought about your interview process. That's one thing, right? You're not giving them feedback about why they were rejected. So that's one thing. We'll set that aside. I think to your point, in terms of giving candidates specific feedback about why you passed on them, I don't know that there's an absolute, model practice around how you should approach that. If you do provide specific feedback, you absolutely will be opening yourself up for that kind of criticism, that kind of snark. You have to be prepared for that. If you're willing to do that, you're willing to put yourself out there and say, okay, like some people are just gonna, again, it's an emotional process. Being rejected sucks. So people may take that on you, and you have to be comfortable with that. Right. If you make that call. There's other, potential legal reasons in some regions or countries of, where that could come back in litigation on you, which I think is why most companies as a default, they don't give specifics. I think if you do, you have to try to, be thoughtful in the way that you deliver the feedback. And in some cases there may not be a thoughtful way of being able to convey the real reason why they didn't get the job. And so, yeah, I don't, I don't claim to say that every company should do that at all times. I think surveying, getting feedback, yes, you should do that. Having application FAQs on the front end, so you're able to address some of the questions about the interview process and timelines and things like that. Everybody should do that. But in terms of giving kind of specific one-on-one rejection of feedback, that's also something that's really hard to do at scale. So it's like one thing, like if you If you have 100 applicants, 10 of them interview, 5 of them get to the second round, and you hire one. Okay, the way that you think about how you let all those people go is different, right? Those 90 people who never even got an interview, they don't necessarily, deserve or expect specific feedback as to why you did. Like, no recruiting team is built to do that on an individual basis. Like that part's not realistic. I think it's more of like the people who get deep into the interview process, and where you can share there.
Cool. Okay, last question. What's your piece of advice for HR practitioners as we go into potentially a more hybrid model? I mean, in Canada, a lot of us are still not back at offices, very similar, but what do you think HR practitioners should be paying attention to, say, come the fall, winter, that kind of a thing? Is there anything?
I think the most important thing is that the majority of us will have some sort of a hybrid work structure moving forward. When it's safe to get people back in an office, most of us, those of us who had the ability to have our employees work remotely during the pandemic, will never have 100% of our employees back in the office. The vast majority of us will not. The vast majority of us will have some level of a hybrid structure. If you are in that majority, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that's what a lot of companies will be doing, especially companies that have knowledge workers and people that can do their jobs remotely. The bad news is of co-located, fully distributed, or hybrid's definitely the most difficult to manage. And the reason that is that most companies, if you kind of follow the evolution of the pandemic, you were all in an office, everybody was remote. Now people are going to start coming back in the office. Some people are going to stay remote. And all of your programs, your operating rhythms, your operating system prioritization was always oriented around an office-based organization. If you maintain that while you still have a sizable portion of your employee base remote, you're creating two caste systems, if you will, of employees. And the ones who are remote will always be disadvantaged to the ones that are able to come back into an office. And so if you really want to build an optimal structure, even in a hybrid scenario, build all of your systems and practices as if everybody is remote. And so that way, whoever's in an office, there's no natural advantage to them in being so. That obviously they can do whatever they want, but they won't be at an inherent advantage to those who cannot come into an office or will not come into an office, based on the way that your organization kind of sets your operating rhythms.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that takes us to the end of the show today. Once again, Lars, thank you so much for being here. It means a lot. I'm happy to share the book. There are also 10 people, like I said, that signed up for the link, and they were the first to go. So they'll all be receiving an email today of asking where we're supposed to send it. Because normally we would say, hey, come to our office and pick it up. Because we had a pretty rad space, but we're not doing that right now. So we had to rethink our strategy around that one.
Yeah.
Our next session will be held on Monday, March 15th at 1 p.m. 12 p.m. We were just doing this one special for you, Lars, at 1.
Oh, thank you.
Our guest is going to be organizational psychologist Justin. Oh, I knew I was going to screw this one up. Dionarine out of Edmonton. Justin and I will be talking all things burnout and even dive into his own journey. What I think is really cool about Justin is he actually traveled alongside rock stars and reality. He was the psychologist who made sure that reality TV shows could actually stand up to reality, or perhaps even, these people are going to be real disasters. So he's got some good stories. I can guarantee he's already shared a couple with me, so I'm excited to have Justin join us on March 15th, but we'll be sending out a link. Once again, Lars, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and thanks for the great questions. I appreciate them.
Okay, all right, well, take care, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today.